We are starting off with Cassie Brinley.
All right, everyone. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much for being here. It means a lot to every one of us presenters. My name is Cassie Brinley, and my topic that I decided to focus on, something I'm very passionate about, is the connection between extracurricular activity and that correlation with student development, both cognitive and emotional. I'll go a little bit more into exactly what I was researching in a second. So firstly, why is this a topic that matters to me? I'm somebody who, throughout my life, has been involved in tons and tons of extracurriculars. I've done pretty much every sport under the sun. I'm in choir and theater and Model UN, ASB, you name it. I've probably done it at some point. And I'm also somebody who's very dedicated to my academics. I've had a 4.0 since 3rd grade. I intend to keep it. And I also am very interested in developmental psychology, and particularly in terms of how maybe my upbringing with all of these sports and extracurriculars has affected my academics. So a little bit of background about this topic. What exactly is an extracurricular activity? That's a term that's pretty loosely tossed around. Well, according to Merriam-Webster, an extracurricular activity is any student activity, such as athletics, that is connected with school and usually carrying no academic credit. So think anything that I just mentioned. Robotics, Model UN, ASB, any type of sport. Anything that's not actually connected to the school. It doesn't affect your grades at all, but it is done on the side. And an interesting statistic is that 80% of high schoolers in the US participate in at least one extracurricular activity. And this is a number that's actually gone up in recent years. It used to be around 50% back in the 80s. So, to clarify, the specific research question that we're going to be tackling here that we'll delve into throughout this presentation is, what is the effect of extracurricular activities on cognitive and emotional development? I had 4 primary research methods. The first would be professional surveys. I spoke to the 4 counselors here at Bellarmine. I surveyed them. They're educated on all sorts of topics that are related to this. And I got some really interesting feedback, and you'll see later. Secondly, I took a look at previous studies that were done in academic settings, college papers, other sorts of professional analytics that were done. Anytime you see a graph, it will usually be from a previous study. Additionally, I conducted 2 faculty interviews with both Mr. Brown and Mr. Dempsey, who are psych majors, but also are moderators for different extracurricular programs here at Bellarmine, those being soccer and Model UN. Lastly, I conducted a student survey last year, and I won't lie, this didn't give me as much definitive information as I would have hoped. It had about 50 responses. You will see this pop up once or twice in here with some pretty interesting info. But I will talk later about why there might have been some interesting stuff happening with that. So firstly, I'd like to touch on academic effects of extracurriculars. These are the results from the counselor surveys. As you can see, pretty unanimous. 100% of them said yes, students in extracurricular activities do better academically. There were 2 primary reasons gave, as you can see in these quotes from them. Firstly, students that have a busy schedule of co-curricular tend to schedule their time better and have better study habits. Secondly, high-achieving students in academics usually apply themselves similarly in extracurricular activities. This is a previous survey, or a previous analytic that was done in a college setting. Essentially, students involved in extracurriculars and those not were all given the same 4 tests, spanning from 2 different kinds of English classes to a math test and a science test. And as you can see by the numbers that are kind of circled there in orange, students who were involved in extracurricular activities on average scored up to 6 points higher than those not involved in extracurriculars. goals. Then there are other indicators of academic success, those being things like number of absences, number of skipped classes, and GPA. As you can see by these numbers that have been circled, participants in extracurriculars had much better attendance records and also tended to have better GPAs. And this is something that actually makes quite a bit of sense, right? If you're involved in a sport, you're required to go to a certain number of classes in the day or else you can't play at practice or in a game later that day. And so obviously there's a connection between the number of classes you attend and how well you do in that subject. So wouldn't it stand to reason that if you're incentivized to be in class, because you have to be in order to continue playing your sport or being in your extracurricular, then shouldn't you be doing better academically? When I spoke to Mr. Brown and Mr. Dempsey, their academic effects that they outlined tended to fall within two separate categories. First being direct. What is a direct effect, one might ask? Well, there's things like incentive to do better in class so the activity doesn't get taken away. As I already mentioned, this would also fall into academic probation, things like that. Secondly, this is a little bit niche, but as a choir kid myself, I was quite interested in this. Being able to read music can improve basic math skills. Then there are indirect effects, which tend to do a little bit more with skills that you learn in extracurriculars that can help you academically. Things like organizational skills and time management. Mr. Brown even said, ironically, athletes' grades tend to be best in season. Doesn't that seem a little counterintuitive? Well, actually no, because if you think about it, if you have more stuff on your plate, you have to regiment your time a little bit more strictly, which means that you're probably keeping up with your assignments a little better. And lastly, certain extracurricular activities that are more geared toward public speaking. You have to develop skills like presentational skills, better confidence, think Model UN, Capstone. This is a quote from Mr. Brown that you'll notice kind of colored the rest of my presentation. And that is, he said, chicken or the egg? Does my program attract students who are strong academically? Or does my program lead to strong academic performance? This was the moment I realized I'm probably not doing a causational study. This is definitely more of a correlational study. And so then I started thinking about the rest of this project a lot differently. When I first decided to research this topic, something I was very, very interested in was, does this supposed correlation between better grades and involvement in extracurriculars, does it change between activities, whether it be STEM-based activities or humanities or arts, anything like that? These are some results from the student survey that I did. I know it's a little bit crazy, but essentially I asked for all of their extracurricular involvements and also their SAT scores on the left and GPA on the right. And since this is a lot, I'll break it down for you. It didn't tell me a whole lot. There was basically no predictable variation. What I mean by that is I couldn't definitively say, oh yeah, MUN kids, they're blowing everybody else out of the water. That's just not the case. Essentially, it's just a pretty mixed bag, and it seemed to be much more different based on individuals than it did based on activity. The counselors were split, as you can see. I hope they didn't have a civil war over this. Half of them said that there's no difference between correlation of different activities, which lines up with the previous graphic I showed. And then the other half said that there's a higher correlation of good grades with MUN and robotics specifically. When I talked to Mr. Brown and Mr. Dempsey, they said it really depends on the person. They both said it ranges in all activities, and it's more different from person to person than from activity to activity. Who would have guessed? Different people work differently. But they did mention something very interesting. Some students struggle in season because of massive time commitment. And as you can see by the little picture up there, that is our lovely robotics team. There seems to be a little bit of an interesting thing here of a tipping point. So athletes in season do better in classes because they have to regiment their time more. But robotics and other activities in season, they have such a big time commitment that they have no time to regiment. So there does seem to be a little bit of a tipping point in terms of involvement in these extracurriculars. So you can imagine my dismay when I'm researching this, and I'm like, oh, I'm getting some good stuff here. This is really, really awesome. And then I come across one massive confounding variable, and that is socioeconomic status. So as you can see in the graph on the left, this is the percentage of students, the y-axis, is percentage of students who are involved in clubs and other sorts of extracurriculars. And the different lines, different colors represent who is above and below poverty line. The blue line on the very top is above the poverty line. The purple is the poverty line, and the dark blue underneath is below the poverty line. And as you can see, those who tend to be of higher socioeconomic status are generally involved in more extracurriculars. Then if we take a look at the graph on the right, the x-axis on the bottom here is showing different economic classes. And as you can see, the top 0.1% of those, the top 0.1% of those economic classes do way better on SATs. And it's not even close. So that begs the question, do they have better grades because they're in extracurricular activities or because they have more money? When I took a look at the surveys on the counselors, every single one of them said yes. Students with more money have better access to extracurricular activities. Kids with money can afford more opportunities, period. When I spoke to Mr. Brown and Mr. Dempsey, they said a very similar thing, but what they told me kind of split up once again in two separate camps. First would be practicality. You have less money, you have less access to things like tutors, maybe you have a job on the side, so you have less access to time. Additionally, academic extracurricular activities, like AutoUN or robotics, which we already mentioned, might have a higher correlation with better academics. They tend to be more expensive. As Mr. Brown states here, for MUN, you have to buy a suit. For football, they hand you a uniform. Then when it comes to psychology, oftentimes those of lower socioeconomic class are encouraged to be less well-balanced. As Mr. Dempsey puts it here, if I'm good at this extracurricular, that's kind of my ticket. So I put a lot of emphasis on that in that area. You see this a lot with sports. If you have a child who is not quite as wealthy, and they show some promise in basketball, football, anything like that from a young age, oftentimes they're pressured by parents or by people around them. This is where you need to put your time and energy because this is how you're going to get scholarships. This is your ticket to college. And so in a way, they're encouraged to be less well-balanced and not as good students. So there is some information on here that is helpful when it comes to the Bellarmine student survey that I did, but I need to mention something important. So obviously my survey was done on Bellarmine students. Not quite like all of the students in the nation, I might say. First of all, we do have a higher rate of wealthy students. We only have 7% of students at Bellarmine who qualify for reduced lunch, whereas in the US, 50% of students register for reduced lunch or qualify for it. So that's a pretty clear indication of a difference in socioeconomic status with our student body versus others. And additionally, there's a higher rate of students at Bellarmine in extracurricular activities versus in the nation. It's about 85% here at Bellarmine versus 80% in the rest of the nation. And the 85% doesn't even include stuff that's done outside of school. It's only stuff done at Bellarmine. With that said, I do think that these bottom statistics are quite interesting. One of the questions on the survey was asking, essentially, do you believe that in your experience, your socioeconomic status has contributed positively or negatively in any way to your academic success or your ability to be in extracurriculars? 22% said yes, they believe they have less opportunities because their families are poorer. And 43% said that they believe they have more opportunities because their families are wealthier. And if you can't do the math super quickly, that's all right. That's a majority. That's 65% of students at Bellarmine who took this survey who believe that in some way that their grades and extracurricular involvement is impacted by the amount of money that their parents make. Now that begs the question, is it still worth it? If all of these academic effects that I mentioned previously in the presentation can be chalked up to, well, some people just make more money, is it still worth it to put your kids into extracurriculars? I would argue yes, and here's the reason why. Emotional impact. Mr. Brown and Mr. Dempsey spelled it out pretty clearly. Positive effects of extracurriculars, this can be seen in so many different ways. First of all, improved confidence, improved maturity, a sense of belonging, conflict resolution skills, and problem-solving skills. The only negative effect they mentioned was this idea of a crack under pressure, a burnout with that tipping point I previously mentioned. I love this graph. Okay, so essentially what this is showing, the y-axis is an RCAD-P score, and that is a test that's done to basically figure out anxiety and depression within individuals. So the higher the score, the higher you score for anxiety and depression. And so you have worse anxiety and depression with a higher score. The blue bars are those involved in extracurriculars. The orange bars are those not involved in extracurriculars. On the left is pre-pandemic participation, right is post-pandemic participation. As you can see, in every single one of these bars, the blue bar, extracurricular involvement, is much lower, scores much lower for anxiety and depression than non-participation. And I think Mr. Dempsey put it perfectly. And it kind of sums up the meat of this project and all of my research, is that it's about being part of something larger than yourself. Even if you're in an individual sport or some sort of activity that involves just you competing, you're still part of a bigger group. You're still part of a team in some way. And that can contribute to you feeling not only like you're not alone, but it also has to do with, I'm getting better for other people too. And so since you have that feeling of being part of something bigger than yourself, there is that sense of belonging, and it does contribute to very positively the childhood emotions and emotional development. So in conclusion, I cannot say for sure if extracurricular involvement leads to better academics, considering, first of all, that this study is more correlational than it is causational. It is an observational study, meaning I didn't do an experiment, so I can't quite say for sure. And additionally, the socioeconomic status confounding variable is a little bit annoying and does throw a wrench into things. So for that reason, I can't say that there is an effect necessarily. There definitely is a relationship. I will say this though, extracurriculars do improve certain skills in emotional well-being. And I think that's valuable enough to continue to put your kids into these programs and to continue to participate in these programs as students. Thank you. Okay, questions? I'm involved in Scouts BSA, which I really enjoy. That's a really big part of my life. I like being outdoors. I like feeling useful and being able to do CPR and start fires. But yeah. Stop it.
So, do you think it would have been more interesting if you focused your study on truly extracurricular instead of club? So, like, the difference being, like, you know, you have to, like, have to invest money in extracurriculars, you have to buy gear, you have to buy suits, whatever. But for clubs, you really just show up. You know, do you think it would be interesting to
Sure, that would definitely be interesting. I will say, though, that the socioeconomic component does apply to clubs that don't pay for it either. Because if you think about students who are a little bit poorer, they still don't have access to they don't have access as much to time. Maybe they have another job outside. So there still is that confounding variable, although I will say it's to a lesser degree. The line between club and extracurricular is pretty darn blurred. Technically knowledgeable in a club, technically multi-when is a club. And so that line is pretty blurred, but that would be an interesting thing to look into. Okay.
everyone, my name is Tegan Ellington, and today I'm going to be presenting on the ethical implications of genetic engineering. So my targeted research question is, how will ethical dilemmas impact the future applications of genetic engineering, specifically applied to CRISPR-Cas9? So this topic is not only niche, but also complex and controversial. Yeah, I'm so fascinated by this question. I first learned about genetic engineering in freshman year biology class here at Bellarmine. And since then, I've researched and compiled data on genetic engineering and have been completely compelled by the hope this holds for our future. However, the complexity of this topic has been increased with a conversation I had with my dad. And he brought into the aspect of like ethicality and how this is the hope for CRISPR is hindered by humanity itself. And this is why I'm so excited to have researched this topic. So now I'm going to explain some important vocabulary and help give everyone some background on my talk to help further the understanding of my data. So first, I've mentioned this idea of genetic engineering, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard of this before, but the formal definition is using laboratory-based technology to alter the natural genes of an organism. And then another term I should mention is GMOs, which are genetically modified organisms that have changes to the genome, which essentially means like their genes were changed. And you've probably heard of this, especially with respect to food and crops. Next, I'm going to explain what exactly CRISPR-Cas9 is, especially considering its centrality to my research question. So CRISPR is another acronym, and it stands for Clustered Regularly Interspaced Palindromic Repeats, and then Cas9 is just an associated protein. And together, they are the most hopeful and promising gene editing technology. So if you're like me, even knowing what CRISPR stands for, the actual application may still be confusing. To remedy this, I'll use the metaphor of a pair of scissors, which you can see in these two infographics. Imagine CRISPR-Cas9 as a pair of scissors that can go into the gene and splice and cut or add genes as the scientist wills. This means this gene editing technology allows the elimination of seemingly bad genes and the addition of new desired genes. So moving on to the development of genetic engineering, where the first practical application was in crops and agriculture, known as those GMOs I mentioned earlier. So this is a really complex timeline, but as a summary, the process begins in 1940, where scientists discover using radiation to randomly change DNA, but they can't quite control it yet. And then in 1994, the first GMO product was approved by the FDA for human consumption, which was a tomato. And then about 20 years later after that, with the mass success of genetically modified agriculture, in 2015, the FDA approved genetic modification in animals for use as food, which was a salmon first. And then this leads us to about where we are today. So now some crowd interaction. So with this, in your current knowledge from your individual experiences, if you could please talk with those at your tables about your personal beliefs on if food should be or should not be genetically modified for human consumption.
I know.
Okay, now I'd like to bring your attention to a survey that I sent out and collected data on 75 students at Bellarmine, similar to the Bellarmine survey that Patsy did. I will intermittently refer to this data throughout this presentation to show the progression of opinions in different realms and application of genetic engineering. So for all the bar charts that I will show you, the y-axis or vertical axis on the left represents the number of students, and the x-axis or horizontal axis on the bottom represents the level of personal ethicality that each student chose for the prompt. Each response shows four options for this, which range from never ethical, rarely ethical, sometimes ethical, and always ethical. With that, this prompt was about the morality of using genetic engineering on crops or food to further efficiency. This yielded results of a majority of students saying this is sometimes ethical, but overall about 70% of students believe this practice is sometimes or always ethical. And this is generally a positive ethicality rate. So this bar graph presents the growth of the genetic modification. I pulled the students on in just that last chart. The exponential upward growth that you can see in this chart in the pattern from 1996 to 2016 is obvious and apparent, which is reiterating that timeline from earlier where it grew really fast. So with that, if genetic modification was able to experience massive growth, is it such a stretch to apply the same projection to genetic modifications and engineering in other fields besides crops and agriculture? In short, scientists asked the same question and said this would not be a stretch. In fact, this is another bar chart formulated by Grand-View Research that shows the projected growth of the genome editing market from 2020 to 2030 in the United States. So today is about exactly in the middle of this chart. As I'm sure you've noticed by now, this chart is extremely reminiscent of the chart I just showed you of genetic modification in agriculture. It's also noteworthy that CRISPR-Cas9 is responsible for 43.52% of global revenue. In this projection, which means CRISPR will have the greatest technology size in the genome editing scene. So everything up to this point in this presentation has been illuminated in a positive light, probably raising questions to the controversiality of my topic. Although this becomes apparent with this map, genetic engineering has been expanding to the use on animals and now logically to the use on humans. This has created uproar in not only ethical dilemmas but also legal complications, seen in this color-coded map. So red, all the red countries, have a ban on CRISPR essentially by legislation. Purple countries have a ban with guidelines. Green has a ban, but there's like ambiguous and looser rules. And then blue has restrictive rules, but it's not banned. And so as you can see, the United States is blue, which means that genetic modification on human embryos here is not blatantly outlawed, just restricted and overseen and used very cautiously. So now I'm going to go back to that same survey I referenced earlier, but this one with a different prompt. So the students were prompted to say their opinion on morality of using genetic engineering on diseases and or abnormalities or for efficiency purposes on an animal. So just different in the sense that it's an animal, the last one was crops. So this time, the majority of students said this was rarely ethical, though similar numbers said this was sometimes ethical, so it's kind of centered around the middle. Although it is an important pattern that 56%, or more than half, of the students believe that this is never or rarely ethical, a much more negative-centric response than the previous one of the genetic modification of crops. So back to the application of CRISPR-Cas9 in humans, and the hope this would bring to humanity. There are currently many successful human trials in the medical field of the curing of previously fatal diseases. Specifically, genetic engineering has triumphed over sickle cell disease, cystic fibrosis, beta thalassemia, and many types of cancer. Continually, the National Library released a statement saying the gene editing capabilities of CRISPR-Cas9 offer opportunities to develop a new class of precise targeted therapeutics in oncology. CRISPR-Cas9 systems have been effective in both completed and ongoing trials in preclinical and clinical phases. Along with reducing the threat of fatal diseases, the Pew Research Center polled the American public about using gene editing technology on babies to reduce the risk of one of these diseases. The pie chart exemplifies the division of public opinion, with just under a third thinking this is a bad idea entirely, the same amount thinking it's a good idea, and 39% unsure of how even to consider this topic. In the same survey, the public was asked if they thought that gene editing to lower chances of developing serious diseases would even improve quality of life. This time, around 39% think that quality of life would be better than now. 40% think quality of life would be about the same as now, and 18% think that quality of life would be worse than now if they were genetically modified as a baby. The result of these two polls shows the complex and interesting relationship of the public opinion on genetic engineering and the prosperity of its application. Just as you have before, please discuss with those at your table how your personal beliefs about using genetic engineering to cure or reduce the risk of diseases and or abnormalities on a human. Okay, now I'm going to transition again. So this is the bar chart, another bar chart from that same survey. And I asked Bellarmine students essentially what you just talked about. They were prompted with the same question: what level of ethicality do they assign to using genetic engineering on diseases and or abnormalities on a human embryo? This distribution is interestingly similar to the responses about genetic modification on diseases and or abnormalities on an animal, with the center being that this is rarely ethical and 55% of students believing this is never or rarely ethical, so center on the left side. This is the closest distribution yet to the balancing of being moral and immoral in this survey. So it's pretty even. So now we can compare my local survey of Bellarmine students to a national collection of surveys made by various networking sites about genetic engineering. So this chart reads in columns from left to right, starting with the topic the survey prompted, the source that sent out the poll in the middle, and then on the far right is the percent affirmative, or in other words, the percent of the public that agrees with the practice of and morality concerning each topic. These topics in this chart center around curing fatal diseases and reducing the risk of inheriting fatal diseases. And the statistics that I want to emphasize is the percent affirmative, all of which are more than half, as you can see on the far right. The most of them are higher than 75%. So more than every 3 in 4 Americans thought this practice was ethical. This is an extremely promising result for the application of CRISPR in the future for the uses on disease. Another relevant quote from the National Library of Medicine reads, "It is important to note that basic research objectives and gene editing techniques are also closely tied with the therapeutic or enhancement interventions, thereby adding a layer of complexity for the principal purpose of the technique." This brings up the next aspect of my presentation, arguably the most important and complex aspect: the application of genetic engineering to physical or superficial attributes that may cause an unnatural or unfair advantage of some people over others. So to add to the collection of my data in researching, I conducted an interview with a reproductive endocrinologist and infertility specialist in Dallas, Texas, Dr. Robbie Gott. With owning a fertility clinic that specializes in the treatment of infertility, Dr. Gata was able to provide a unique perspective on the future applications of CRISPR-Cas9, especially considering this relevance to his field in the future. While Dr. Gata had many informative quotes, I chose 3 that were particularly enlightening to share. Firstly, he proclaimed that scientists think there are about 10,000 medical disorders that you can actually take genes from and cure those, or essentially that you could use CRISPR on and cure those. I also confronted him with the difficult question on how he sees the growth of genetic engineering and using CRISPR-Cas9 will impact the future of humanity. To which he responded that laws will get passed that gene editing cannot be done for cosmetic reasons, but will be approved for diseases. But there will always be countries that people can go to with less restrictive laws. This is reminiscent of that map I showed earlier. However, when prompted if he thought the ethical concerns will restrict CRISPR's use for diseases in humans, he said that, quote, "These will not slow down the medical therapy applications." So the American Psychological Association brings up the further complexity of using genetic engineering for desired physical attributes with the statement, "In a classical social psychology study called What is Beautiful is Good, found that strangers rated attractive people as possessing socially desirable traits to a greater extent than unattractive people. and that attractive people were also expected to lead better lives than unattractive people, achieve more prestigious occupations, be more competent spouses with happier marriages, and have better prospects for personal fulfillment. This presents the underlying ethical contradiction, asking where do we, as a society, draw the line of what should be allowed to be genetically modified in humans and what shouldn't be. So with this psychological study in mind, some people think that it's logical to stretch that making a child more conventionally attractive would indeed better their life, maybe in such a dramatic way to be comparable with reducing the risk of inheriting a fatal disease. So I want to again bring your attention to the same collection of surveys from a varying media sources, but this time to a different set of prompts. These 4 prompts center not only on superficial and cosmetic, such as changing eye color, hair color, or intelligence, but also asking the public if they think this is a moral to do to their own child, as you'll see in the prompt they also yours. Directing your attention to the percent affirmative column, just as I did with the last one, these percentages are much lower, with a high of 28%, but an average percent affirmative of 15%, which means roughly 1 in every 6 Americans believe these practices are ethical and acceptable, which is much lower compared to the 3 in every 4 from that earlier chart. So this could be the deciding factor on how CRISPR will be regulated and monitored to prevent any malpractice in this way, especially with how negatively the public views this, even though there's very limited clinical research on this particular application. So as my last set of data, I want to share the final prompts results of my local survey with you. This prompt was rating the ethicality of using genetic engineering on physical attributes for human embryos. This data is clearly skewed to the left, favoring never ethical, with 84% of students saying this is never or rarely ethical. This is very persuasive evidence of negative feedback on this application of CRISPR. To conclude, I want to assert that while the future applications of CRISPR-Cas9 and genetic engineering in general are very helpful, especially with the multiple successful clinical trials on cancer and various blood diseases, essentially curing the incurable, many factors will hinder this success. While the actual undergoing of changing physical attributes is an extensive and tedious process, likely to cost an unfathomable amount of money, the idea is feasible, which is a scary thought and one that society is currently contemplating. Ultimately, the use and restrictions of genetic engineering will come down to weighing the prospect of positive results with the risk of the abuse of this power to modify genes. This interpretation, as Dr. Grotto pointed out, will likely differ from area to area. Finally, I'd like to leave you with this quote from Jennifer Doudna, a Nobel Prize-winning biochemist, saying CRISPR technology will be increasingly woven into the fabric of our lives in positive ways, but it comes with extraordinary responsibility. Thank you so much for your time. Questions?
Have you read Codebreaker? It's Jennifer Doudna's biography, and it's very, very good. So I haven't met. And also, my question is, have you considered that maybe some of the results of these polls and studies are more skewed towards maybe not as ethical because there's so much fear-mongering and disinformation around CRISPR and genetic engineering in general?
I do think that lack of information is an important aspect of this topic, especially with that one study I showed where almost 40% of Americans don't even know where to start or consider with this topic. So I think the farther along we are with experiments, that it'll get more and more public, and with that advancement, there will be a greater and stronger opinions made by everyone around us.
Did your opinion change as you conducted the research with your
I think similarly, like this project allowed me to gain a lot more information on CRISPR and its uses, and ultimately I just think it's a very interesting technology that will result in hopefully saving a lot of lives.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you once again for being here. This is my capstone presentation entitled Distance Education and Its Impacts on High School Student Performance. So first off, I just want to start by introducing myself. So hi, my name is Ogechi Nakem and I am a senior here at Bellarmine Prep. I chose this topic for my research because, like most of us here, the COVID-19 pandemic had a notable impact on my life. As a 12 and 13-year-old, COVID disrupted some of the most formative years of my education, leaving a lasting mark that I can still feel in my learning today. Through remote learning, loss of peer connections, and changes to educational policy, COVID massively affected my retention rates and levels of motivation. As I've reflected on my personal experience and developed an interest in psychology over the years, I've wondered how the performance of others my age was affected during such formative years, so I made that the premise of my research. Again, I'm sure that everyone in this room knows what COVID-19 is and the many ways that it affected our world, but I still just want to provide a bit of context. COVID-19 was announced as a global pandemic on March 11th of 2020 by the World Health Organization, and schools nationwide closed 2 days later as a quarantine measure. Remote learning systems were implemented soon after, and students of all ages began learning behind screens and on Zoom calls. Since a situation like this was unprecedented, students and teachers alike often struggled to adapt to and optimize the online learning space, leading to numerous consequences in the coming months and years. Some vocabulary that is related to remote learning includes remedial policies, which are policies that are made to correct or to counteract something. Hybrid learning, which means combining in-person and online learning activities. And learning losses, which are defined as the decline in K-12 academic achievement during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is displayed in this graph up here. And finally, this is kind of a given, but whenever I reference distance, remote, and online learning, they're all synonymous and they can be used interchangeably. And they are defined as the student and the educator not being physically present in a traditional classroom environment. So the overall research question that my project aims to answer is, how has distance education impacted high school student performance during and after the COVID-19 pandemic? I utilized 3 main methods of research that gathered both quantitative and qualitative evidence. The first was analyzing secondary sources, in which I researched 10 published studies that looked into the effects of distance learning while the pandemic was still ongoing. The second was facilitating interviews with 6 different educators from both Bellarmine and beyond, including 2 teachers, 1 of our counselors, our vice principal, and 2 professors of educational psychology from accredited universities. And finally, I conducted qualitative studies through 2 surveys of the Bellarmine community, one sent out to the student body that got 97 responses, and one sent out to educators that received 11 responses. Both the interviews and the surveys looked into the effects of distance learning after distance education was no longer being widely implemented in the United States. So again, my first research method was researching 10 quantitative studies conducted between 2020 and 2021. These sources investigated different aspects of the online learning experience during COVID, such as changes in study habits, time management skills, and the perceived effectiveness of online learning by students. Each source is from a peer-reviewed journal or a reputable digital library, such as JSTOR or the Social Science Research Network. And since 10 studies is a lot to cover in one presentation, I will be highlighting the findings from the 2 that I found to be the most relevant. This first study is from the Social Science Research Network, and it researches the gap between expected learning and actual learning as students returned to in-person classes. The study was conducted on 6th through 12th grade students in Brazil by analyzing published quarterly data from 2018 to 2021, where each quarter is representative of 3 months. This first graph up here shows the evolution of learning losses from 2018 to 2021. The solid black line shows the expected learning of the secondary school students, while the dashed line shows their actual learning. The graph shows that their actual learning deviates in the last quarter of 2019, around the same time that COVID was announced, and it begins to partially recuperate in the last quarter of 2020, around the same time that hybrid learning was being widely implemented. The gap between the 2 lines represents the learning loss of the students, similarly to this infographic here that was referenced earlier. Now, this graph is not a part of the study, but simply serves as a visual aid, just like how this green margin between the 2 lines shows the difference between the expected learning and the actual learning of students during the pandemic. The gap between the solid and dashed lines in this graph is also representative of learning losses. Now, this is another graph from the same study, and it shows the average percentage of accumulated learning losses per school quarter, with the first bar on the left representing the fourth quarter in 2020, and the last bar on the right representing the fourth quarter in 2021. As the graph shows, learning losses had a negative trajectory through 2021, beginning at over 90% and dropping to 63%. Since lower percentages in this graph equate to higher levels of learning loss, the students in this study had a 27% increase in learning losses from 2020 to 2021. So overall, both graphs from this study show that significant learning losses are directly tied to distance and hybrid learning. This next study from the British Educational Research Association, this study is from the British Educational Research Association, and in which a survey about remote learning conditions was sent to over 1 million students in the Chinese Guangdong province in March of 2020. This bar graph here shows the results of questions asking about the positive aspects of early distance learning. Nearly 60% of students believed that remote learning helped them to learn anytime, anywhere, and over 80% believed that it was more convenient to review course content, showing that these students appreciated the convenience aspect of distance learning the most. And this is a graph from the same study, and it shows the results of questions asking about the difficulties of early distance learning. The main barriers that were brought up by students were excessive eye strain, poor internet connection, and disengagement caused by outside disturbances. Overall, the convenience aspect of distance learning was seemingly overshadowed by these sources of disengagement. So overall, both studies from the Social Science Research Network and the British Educational Research Association provide an international perspective on distance learning, while the other 8 studies that I researched and did not go over in this presentation proved that their findings are generalizable to students in the United States. So moving on to my second research method, I interviewed 6 educators from both Bellarmine Prep and from accredited universities. And I'm just going to quickly run through who each of them are and some of their qualifications as candidates. The first is Dr. Janine Jones from the University of Washington Seattle campus, where she is a professor of school psychology as well as their associate dean of academic affairs, and she is a picture on the right. And then there is Professor Emma McMain, who holds a PhD in educational psychology and teaches at Washington State University, pictured below on the right. The next 4 are all members of our Bellarmine staff. Mr. Berg is our Vice Principal of Curriculum and Instruction. Mr. Scotty is one of our 4 counselors. Mrs. Hannigan is a member of our English department. And Mr. Dempsey is our Director of Student Leadership and a Bellarmine psychology teacher. A question that was asked to all 6 interviewees was, what do you believe are the most prominent effects of distance education on overall learning, engagement, and participation in high school students? Although those interviewed came from various professional backgrounds, they all shared the sentiment that distance education had a large negative impact on student morale and mental health. Mr. Scotty and Mr. Dempsey both cited increased rates of anxiety, suicide, and depression, which have persisted into the modern day. Withdrawal of social connections from not being in the physical learning environment was referenced as one of the leading causes of declining mental health, and was also cited by all 3 teachers as a cause of social immaturity in returning students. Barriers to engagement during online learning was also discussed by Dr. Janine Jones, with barriers including at-home distractions, students having their cameras off during online classes, and a lack of engaging lesson plans within the online learning space. Finally, learning losses were evident to Bellarmine teachers through decreased acquisition of core subjects and decreased standardized testing scores in comparison to previous years. A quote that summarized the sentiment of every educator that I interviewed was, "How can you have morale when you can't be present?" coming from Vice Principal Berg. Confidence, enthusiasm, and discipline were negatively affected by online learning, from negative mental health impacts to engagement barriers and learning losses. Another interview question that was asked was, how have student learning trends changed within the reintegration process? In relation to learning trends, Bellarmine's standardized test scores have bounced back from their initial dip, according to Vice Principal Berg. Scores had nearly returned to pre-COVID levels by 2023, though systems around standardized testing have changed within college admissions. Bellarmine counselor Mr. Scotty cited less student anxiety around SATs and ACTs due to the continuity of test optional and test blind policies into the modern day. Mr. Scotty also referenced the rebounding of learning acquisition across subjects like foreign language and mathematics, meaning that learning losses across numerous subjects have reduced. On the topic of what remedial policies have or could have been effective in reintegrating Bellarmine students into the classroom, both Mr. Berg and Mr. Dempsey referenced a new approach to hybrid learning as a positive approach. Since this learning approach was forced upon us, similarly to remote learning, Bellarmine was unable to fully utilize hybrid learning as a resource. Within a different context and with more preparation, both Mr. Berg and Mr. Dempsey believe that hybrid education could be a beneficial resource that students could choose to utilize. Mrs. Hannigan from our English department referenced grace periods as a policy that was actually put into action during reintegration. Grace was given to students through changes to lesson planning, deadline extensions, and late work policy, reducing stress and burnout rates during reintegration. And finally, the biggest remedial policy emphasized by Mr. Berg were the addition of office hours and an 8:45 start time. Office hours are a resource used in most higher education institutions where professors schedule time outside of class to meet with students one-on-one and give personalized instruction. Bellarmine adopted this model as students transitioned from remote learning to hybrid learning, pushing their start time from 8 a.m. to 8:45 a.m. to allow students time to come in early and receive help from their teachers one-on-one. These are the most prominent approaches since daily office hours and our 8:45 start time are still in effect today and do not seem to be going anywhere. My final research method was conducting qualitative studies of the Bellarmine community. I created and sent out a survey to the Bellarmine student body in spring of 2024, where I received 97 responses, and another sent out to Bellarmine teachers, where I received 11 responses. The main goal of each survey was to collect current student data on student performance and to learn the attitudes of the Bellarmine community on the effects of distance learning. The student survey included a mix of multiple choice and short answer questions regarding topics such as class participation, daily motivation, late assignment submission, and the overall effects of distance learning on their long-term performance. The educator survey included a pretty similar mix of questions and discussed topics such as late assignments, test score trends, and opinions on student motivation and understanding of concepts. So I'm going to start off by summarizing some of the key points of the student survey, which include student opinions on the effectiveness of hybrid learning and student opinions on the overall impacts of distance education. So this is the first graph from the student survey, and it asks, how effective do you believe hybrid learning was compared to completely remote learning, where 1 is less effective and 5 is more effective? It shows that over 80% of Bellarmine students believe that hybrid learning was equally as or more effective than remote learning. This next graph asks, how effective do you believe hybrid learning was compared to completely in-person learning? And shows that the majority of students believed that hybrid learning was equally as or less effective than in-person learning. Therefore, Bellarmine students perceived remote learning to be the least effective form of learning compared to hybrid and in-person due to their personal experiences. So here I just have the two graphs that I covered side by side just to make it a bit easier to visualize, with hybrid versus remote on the left and hybrid versus in-person on the right. As we can see, students believe that hybrid learning was generally more effective than remote and generally less effective than in-person. The next question was, overall, how much do you believe distance education impacted your learning? With 1 being a minimal effect and 5 being a large noticeable effect. 72% of respondents believed that distance education had a notable impact on them, which I will delve deeper into with the next question of, what were the largest effects of distance learning for you? The main ways that students felt that remote learning had impacted them was an increase in procrastination, difficulty focusing and engaging during in-person classes, where engaging can mean anything from hand-raising to participating in class discussion, a decrease in overall motivation and effort, difficulty grasping key concepts during online classes and experiencing negative residual effects as they return to the classroom, and declining mental health, specifically an increase in anxiety, depression, stress rates, and burnout, due to the change in learning structure as well as a lack of interaction with peers. Finally, I will be moving on to the educator survey and summarizing a few of its key points, which include changes to late work policy and the frequency of late work submissions, the changes in the use of outside resources by students, and the overall progression or regression of high school student performance. This first pie chart just serves to provide a bit of context, and it shows the general distribution of changes made to late work policy by teachers. The majority of educators, shown in blue, did make changes to their late work policy, while the minority in red, about 36%, made no changes to their late work policy. So this bar graph asks, pre-COVID, how often did a majority of students submit their assignments late, where 1 is rarely and 5 is nearly every assignment. The graph's distribution shows that prior to distance education, Bellarmine teachers saw a relatively small number of late assignment submissions. Now, this next graph asks, currently, how often do a majority of students submit their assignments late, and shows a clear increase as compared to the last graph. This distribution shows that years after distance education has ended, there is still a prominent negative impact on assignment submission. This ties in with increases in procrastination and burnout, as well as decreases in motivation and effort by students. So again, I just have the two graphs that I covered put side by side, with late assignments pre-COVID on the left and late assignments currently on the right. And through this visual comparison, we can see that the current rate of late assignments is noticeably higher than prior to COVID. The next question asks, compared to pre-COVID, how much change have you observed in the use of outside resources by students? With 81% saying that they have seen a noticeable increase. Outside resources include both approved resources like the Academic Center of Excellence, which we are in tonight, and outside tutoring, as well as unapproved resources like ChatGPT and PhotoMath. The teachers referenced an increase in the use of each type of resource, meaning that there has been a rise in academic dishonesty, as well as a greater need of outside help by students. This is likely linked to students not grasping key concepts during online classes and having greater difficulty understanding current concepts. So many are working to make up for that using different methods. The culminating question of the educator survey was, do you believe that student performance has changed significantly compared to pre-COVID? Overall, the answer was yes. The majority of teachers said that distance education had a negative impact on student performance. A few of the key points that were mentioned were, students had greater difficulty understanding material and concepts across numerous subjects, that student motivation and participation has noticeably decreased, and the residual effects of distance learning have decreased confidence levels and increased stress levels more than in years prior. So overall, teachers perceive distance learning to have a very strong negative impact. Through this research, I have found an answer to the question, how has distance education impacted high school student performance during and after the COVID-19 pandemic? That is generalizable to students from Bellarmine Prep specifically. Distance education impacted high school students during the pandemic by causing significant learning losses, at-home instruction having disengaging aspects such as outside disturbances and lack of structure, feelings of social isolation, and student inability to grasp key concepts across multiple subjects. The impacts after in-person classes had returned were the residual effects of time spent in distance learning. They include a decrease in overall motivation and effort, as well as increases in the following: procrastination, difficulty engaging during in-person classes, rates of depression, anxiety, stress, and burnout, and difficulty understanding material and concepts across subjects even years after the end of distance education. In recent years, however, positive changes have been made to mitigate these decreases at Bellarmine through their office hours and reintegration efforts. Standardized test scores and statistical learning acquisition have nearly reached pre-COVID levels, meaning that learning losses at Bellarmine have lessened even if they are still present. So overall, distance learning has had a lasting negative impact on student performance and morale, but grace and remedial policies have allowed these effects to minimize over the years for our Bellarmine community. The final question of each of my interviews was, do you believe that student performance will ever fully return to its pre-distance learning levels? There was a variety of answers to this question, with many saying that levels are close to returning, while others said that levels will never be the same. These two answers from two of my interviewees, Mrs. Hannigan and Professor Emma McMain, stood out to me, however. I'm always asking, do we want to go back to normal? I hope that overall student performance could learn from COVID as a way to move forward in a new direction. Yes, it'll be different, and that's not a bad thing. Things in education are changing. I think students' performance will come back and be even stronger than ever. The response to the COVID-19 pandemic and global implementation of remote learning were unprecedented, and the lasting effects of both are unprecedented as well. I agree with these quotes that education will likely never be the same as it used to be. I know as a student that my approach to learning has likely permanently shifted since March of 2020. But I also agree with these quotes that these changes do not have to be a bad thing, that we as students and educators can take our experiences with distance education to come back stronger. By conducting research like this on distance education in years to come, I hope that student performance can move forward in a new direction. And so that concludes my presentation. So thank you all so much for listening. Any questions?
Do you think that this learning loss, even if you kind of separated a little bit, do you think that that's something that we'll see in adulthood, like any stats or anything like that, with decreased motivation in the workforce or anything like that?
For my own personal opinion, I do believe that these learning losses will have a lasting negative impact that will affect us probably for the entirety of our lives. I have not personally researched anything into that, but I do personally believe that yes, this will have a lasting impact on us.
Thank you.
All right, everybody.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Lexi Christ, and this is my project on the impact of socioeconomic status and urban planning on food access. So, to start with I'm just going to go in a little bit about why I chose this topic. So firstly, I'm very passionate about cooking, and this has just made me more aware of the privilege I have to access good ingredients and enjoy a wide variety of handmade and healthful foods. Secondly, just being a member of the Tacoma community, one can witness the prevalence of food insecurity and homelessness. And this I have especially seen through volunteering at Tacoma Rescue Mission and Eloise Cooking Pot, which has just given me a glimpse into the impact that warm cooked meals can have on people's lives and the disparities within our community. The guiding question, or the question that was leading me through my research was, how does socioeconomic status and urban planning impact the availability of food and overall health of communities? So the rest of the presentation will be addressing these topics. To start out, here are just some terms to know. So in broad terms, a food desert is a geographic area that lacks sufficient access to healthful and affordable food, especially in low-income communities. And this often includes limited access to grocery stores and a surplus of convenience stores. However, when analyzing this term, it is also important to consider how quality influences access to good food and how organization of supercenters and dollar stores influence shopping patterns. People often consider this term an oversimplification, as it does not account for the more prevalent causes of food inequity, including the social and economic inequalities of race. And for this term, we use the term food apartheid, which reflects the disparity of food access and how they often stem from systems of oppression, such as discriminatory planning and policy decisions. Okay, so now I want you all to turn to someone next to you and take an estimate of what percentage of the United States population you think live in food insecurity today. And if we could have some guesses, raise your hands and give me what you guys think. And when you have an answer, just raise your hand and we can, yeah, Brady? 20%. 20%, okay. Okay, so I asked Bellarmine students the same question, and on average, or the survey had 87 students, and on average, they said around 10%, and according to the Food Research and Action Center, the real estimate is around 12.8, so they were pretty close. You guys were a little high, but that's fine. In addition, 63% of Bellarmine students claimed they had never heard of a food desert before. So during this presentation, I used 3 different methods to acquire the information. Firstly, I conducted scholarly research with academic journals and studies from accredited universities. And secondly, I interviewed Andrea Blue, who is the founder and CEO of Make a Difference Foundation and Eloise Cooking Pod, which is the largest food bank in Pierce County, and they serve 75,000 members of the Tacoma community each month and serve around 700,000 pounds of food each month as well. And lastly, I conducted self-directed research through a survey with Bellarmine students and then going out into our community and taking observations. To begin, I researched the effects of socioeconomic status on food insecurity. And I found that socioeconomic status of families directly influences their likelihood to live in an area considered a food desert. This graph from the United States Department of Agriculture shows that trends tie food insecurity to financial stability, education level, and employment rates. And this is often because when an area has people receiving lower income, grocery stores often relocate out of those areas because for-profit companies seek higher profit lines, which they feel like they can get from areas that have people making a higher income. Now I'm going to present a few maps that demonstrate this correlation. So this map to start is a map of income in Tacoma, where the whiter color is the average income with making between $32,000 and $64,000, and then the more green the color is, the higher the income is from that area. And secondly, this is a food desert map, which, and we're mainly going to be focusing on the red and orange areas in this map, which indicate very limited access to grocery stores. So side by side, we can definitely see some correlations. For example, this white area over here indicates lower income, and in the same area, you see orange and red patterns, which indicate low access to food. Next, we're going to be looking into the effects of redlining discrimination and food apartheid. So, some more terms to know. Redlining is the practice of denying people access to credit card loans because of their race or ethnicity, even if they are personally qualified for these loans. And the history behind this is during the New Deal program of the 1930s, the government offered many insured mortgages for homeowners. And for this, they often color-coded maps to rank the loan worthiness of neighborhoods around the country. And this led many black homeowners to not be able to get loans backed by government insurance, except in the red or yellow regions. And this practice was used until the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which prohibited housing discrimination. However, today this term is still used for race-based exclusionary tactics in real estate. Second, we have supermarket redlining, which is an inclination of major chain supermarkets to relocate their stores out of low-income neighborhoods in favor of the suburbs. This is because of perceived obstacles such as profitability, crime rates, cultural biases, and difficulty finding big enough plots for their stores. Nowadays, supermarket redlining comes less from racial bias, but many of the issues that stem from historically racist practices of redlining from the 20th century. And these are, now I'm going to be showing you a few more maps to compare that demonstrate this correlation between historic redlining and racial discrimination, and racial demographics in our community today. So this is a redlining map made by the government in the 1930s, where yellow zones were meant to indicate declining neighborhoods, and the red zones were deemed areas, or were areas deemed hazardous. And these red and yellow areas were the locations that many black homeowners had to live, as the government would not give them loans for homes in the blue or green areas that were deemed desirable. Fast forward to today, this map shows a 2020 census by race in Tacoma, where the darker the color is, the more highly concentrated of black residents reside in that area. And then here is the food desert map we saw before, where the red and orange areas indicate little to no access to grocery stores. So first, if we take a look at the race census map from 2020 and compare it to the redlining map, we can see some clear overlap where black homeowners were forced to live and where many black homeowners live today, such as in this area right here. And then furthermore, when comparing these maps to food desert maps, we can see how many of these neighborhoods that were red zones are the areas that lack sufficient access to grocery stores today, such as here and here. And that area considered a food desert over in East Tacoma is actually where Eloise Cooking Pot, which I'll get more into later, resides and serves the community. Towards the beginning of my presentation, I mentioned that another aspect that influences access to nutritional food is the quality disparity between grocery stores in different areas. This table here from the National Library of Medicine displays the correlation between higher priced stores and increased availability of healthy foods and vice versa. So as lower income families are less likely to shop at higher priced stores, they're often more likely to buy less fresh or healthy foods, as they're often worse in quality. So as you can see, store quality directly influences shopping patterns. So when Bellarmine students without much context about this subject were asked which of the following solutions would be the most effective, 6% said nutritional education, 30% said nonprofit outreach and deliveries, 40% said better public transportation, and 24% said urban agriculture. So now I'm just going to go through each of these different subjects and how they affect food availability. To start, we have issues with transportation, prices, and distances to grocery store impact low-income communities and their ability to access food. So this graph shows that the lower the income of the family, or that lower income families often who have limited vehicle access live further away from grocery stores. So to just break these down a little bit, the x-axis measures the median family income from the least on the left to the most at the right. The y-axis represents the minimum travel time to the closest grocery store providers. The graph on the right being driving time and the left being walking time. And we're primarily going to be looking at the blue lines, as those indicate grocery stores versus the purple lines indicating restaurants. Additionally, the p-values of almost all of these lines indicate a relatively high statistical significance, and the r-values measure the closeness in association the scatter plot has to the lines. And even though, or this just tells us that these surveys, or this specific survey is decently generalized, however, even though income doesn't have a huge impact on distance from the nearest food provider in car, as we can see as the relatively straight line, we can see that walking distance, as seen on the left, is usually farther, as seen in the steeper slope on that side. This is significant because lower income families are usually less likely to have their own vehicle, and so have to walk or take the bus. You might be thinking, even if they're walking, they can take public transportation, right? Well, yes, but there are many factors that hinder public transportation from being an adequate solution to accessibility. So especially when I was talking with Andrea, she was giving me lots of insight about this topic, and she was explaining how even with public transportation, in many food desert areas, people have to take 2 separate buses to get to the grocery store. Additionally, many people have to care for their children, which leads to difficult decisions needing to be made. such as how will they be shopping? For example, how are they supposed to take their child, possibly a stroller, onto 2 separate buses, carry their bags of groceries all back to their house, and then they have to also make decisions about what they will be buying. So will they go for what's most convenient, what can feed the most people in their family, or what they can carry all the best? So these factors just complicate public transportation from being an adequate solution to, and also contribute to which items are being purchased and demanded in certain grocery stores. Secondly, we have nonprofit outreach and deliveries, which addresses issues with accessibility directly by bringing the food directly to those people in need. One way many nonprofits do this is through mobile food banks. Mobile food banks basically just run around town to different areas, different apartment buildings, homeless camps, motels, senior houses, and make sure they have enough food. For example, Eloise Cooking Pot has 4 mobile food banks who go around our community. In addition, they partner with companies such as DoorDash and Amazon, who all make over 600 deliveries to different areas in our community today, or each week. Thirdly, we have urban agriculture. And urban agriculture can be used to describe 2 separate things. One being gardening on an individual basis, and the other being local or community gardens. So individually, it seems more or less an inadequate solution because people need time, an area, and access to materials. And even with that, growing just a few tomatoes a year won't really make a difference on the supply you have of food. And however, one of the most primary thought solutions to food insecurity is locally sourced food. And this can make healthy food more accessible through decreased prices and abundance. A study published from the National Library of Medicine found that growing and selling food locally simplifies some aspects of the food supply chain, making healthful foods less expensive and within reach. In Tacoma, Andrea described how Eloise Cooking Pot is working to implement community farming today. They are partnering with farmers to create what they call a BIPOC farming hub, where the farmers will be housed in a new building down the street from their food bank, and it will serve as a permanent farmers market to serve the clients in their, that come to Eloise Cooking Pot. And lastly, we have nutritional education. Although nutritional education can help promote wellness and improve health in communities, this can only be done in conjunction with access to culturally diverse foods that incorporate all food traditions and lifestyles. It is really vital to take into account people's food sovereignty, which is basically the ability for communities to determine the quantity and quality of food that they consume. Andrea's approach at Eloise Cooking Pot exemplifies this. For example, they hold votes on which fresh foods they want and know how to cook with. And even though they have a culturally varied population, with many different preferences, they try to honor all of them through this voting system. For example, Andrea explained to me how they serve a lot of halal products. This leads to less food being wasted, and it honors people's human dignity. She quoted that there's always healthy options, but she will never force anyone into an option. In the end of our interview, she concluded that, quote, "I think the solution has to be with us as a people. We have to find some fine line agreement that we're going to make food accessible to people, the food they would normally eat without judgment, period." And I think this statement exemplifies the mindset that we should take when trying to support our community and fight for food equity in the future. So in conclusion, food insecurity and access to healthy food is a nuanced issue caused by an interplay of many different factors. Food apartheid and supermarket redlining show how historically racist practices affect populations today, while factors such as socioeconomic status create transportation barriers and can also influence shopping patterns. If you're wondering how you can help, there are many organizations working to integrate all of these solutions into our community, and they need volunteers. One way you can do this is through Eloise Cooking Pot and Make a Difference Foundation. For example, they have volunteers who run their delivery program, and you can just sign up as a volunteer to drive for just a few hours and make deliveries around Tacoma. And if you want to do this, you can go to Make a Difference Foundation website, and they have a few different other ways that you can volunteer. For example, going in and working for a few hours stocking their shelves, which is what I have personally done, and it was just a really great way to use your time and help out your community. And yeah, thank you guys. questions? Well, last year I went about once a week to Tacoma Rescue Mission and then a few times to Eloise Cooking Pot. This year I've tried to go like around once a month, but things have just been busier. But yeah, I definitely recommend this. Okay, thank you all for listening.
Hi everybody, my name is Natalie, and my Capstone project explores the effects of gender and racial bias in reproductive healthcare. So just a little introduction why I decided to choose this topic. It really stemmed from my interest in pursuing a career in medicine, specifically as an OBGYN. I think it was about 6th grade where I was convinced for a long time that I wanted to be a lawyer because I was really interested in social justice, and I thought that was a great way to get involved in that. However, I realized something that was very prevalent in my life was learning about medicine and learning about the reproductive system. I've always been pretty fascinated with that, and I thought that reproductive medicine had a strong tie to advocacy that I could get involved in. Also recently, there have been trends in maternal mortality rates rising. I'll get into that a little bit later in the presentation. And so I thought that this was very concerning to see, one of the most developed countries in the world, as the United States, to be experiencing this. And it made me think about how do social determinants of health show up in this field. Also, there are just issues around reproductive health care that have been heightened by the current climate surrounding it, current events that make this topic all the more important to discuss and to research. Also, I see general issues of bias in the medical world. So if there is this general issue of bias in the medical world, what specifically does this mean for the rest of reproductive health care? First, I want to just get into some operational definitions, some terms that I will be using during this presentation. First is gender-racial bias. In this presentation, I use this as a subconscious prejudice or discrimination based on perceived gender and or race. Next, reproductive health care refers to the reproductive care of people assigned female at birth. So anything to do with the uterus and all that. Medical professionals, as I used it for my survey specifically, are those in healthcare who have received a medical education or medical certification and works with patients. So this can include doctors, general care physicians, nurses, CNAs, that sort of thing. Next is medical gaslighting, and this is defined as an invalidation of a patient's genuine medical concerns. Intersectionality, which will come up a lot during this presentation, is the interaction between identity and status, including somebody's gender and sexuality, their race, their class, and this is a pretty new term. It was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. Lastly is misogynoir. This is even newer than the previous term. In fact, I'm older than this term. It was coined by Moya Bailey in 2008, and it is a form of discrimination characterized specifically by anti-blackness and misogyny coming together. So that's where that intersectionality aspect really comes into play, where both somebody's blackness and their womanhood contributes to whatever prejudice that they face. First, I want to talk about implicit bias. So why implicit bias over explicit bias? Well, implicit bias is defined as a negative attitude of which one is not consciously aware against a specific group. So explicit bias is essentially the opposite. Think about all the outward things that we would declare racist or sexist. We have those things in our own brains that we don't necessarily think about that harm other groups. And why implicit over explicit bias? It's very simple. You don't realize that you have it. So it's harder to address it, and it's more likely to be unchecked. To get into my survey, I did a survey targeting medical professionals from various fields. The fields that came up the most were pediatrics and, of course, women's health. I had majority Washington participants, and it was a mix of open response and multiple choice. From my participants' demographic, it was mostly white women who responded to the survey. And I had results from 7 states as well, so mostly Washington professionals, but like my next group of people was actually from like North Carolina, so it was across the country. So their familiarity with this topic, as you can see, many of the medical professionals have heard of this term before. I gave them the definition that I also gave to you on implicit bias, and 90% have heard of the term before and knew what it meant. And even if they didn't, they have heard the term before. 10% have heard the term before. And as well as knowing the term, a lot of them have done some sort of training to address this issue in their field. 70% has received implicit bias during your career, and with 42% or 42.9% received it once a year, with only 14.3% receiving it once every few years. So it was quite rare for somebody to have never really experienced this discussion. So a first sort of like case study I wanted to do, getting back to maternal mortality, the new studies showed that there was a drop-off of maternal mortality after the COVID pandemic. So as we have heard tonight, COVID has thrown a wrench in a lot of things, and especially, obviously, in the medical world. So during the pandemic, maternal mortality rates were rising because you had the added factor of women getting sick from COVID. After that, it has dropped off, but there are still like a lot of, there's continual disparities in who is experiencing this mortality rate. The CDC reports that 84% of pregnancy-related deaths are preventable. So these are coming from factors that can be addressed. This isn't an issue that we have to say like, oh, you can't do anything about it. Some people die during birth, but that's all there is. That's not the case at all. And this is coming from a maternal mortality review committee in 36 states, which is a group that the NIH combined, and they basically look over all the deaths over the years, and they determine how it came to be. Black and brown women specifically are at a higher risk of maternal mortality, as you'll see in the next slide. And that's really exemplifying intersectionality at play, because they are experiencing these prejudices during their care, not only because they are women, but because they are women of color. Additionally, they are more likely to not have proper access to reproductive care, comprehensive reproductive care and compassionate reproductive care, because women of color, women a lot, and people of color are at a higher risk of poverty. According to National Women's Law Center, in 2023, more than 1 out of 10 women over the age of 18 lived in poverty, and there were particularly high rates for women of color, with 16.8% Black women, 16.3% Latino women, and 20.4% Native women. So as you can see, there's a graph where you can, from 2021 and 2022, the deaths. So Black women have some of the highest maternal mortality rates, and then next is Hispanic women, and Asian women have some of the lowest maternal mortality rates. So now I want to cover the racial bias side of things. As an overview, I wanted to look at each type of woman and how their race or their ethnicity might tie into the type of care they receive. For Native women specifically, I was very surprised to see this, but it makes sense given the historical background of what Indigenous people experience. They are generally overlooked. But they also have some of the highest rates of poor reproductive health. That includes more likely to experience STIs and STDs, more likely to become pregnant as a teenager, higher infant maternal mortality rates, and less access to reproductive care. And this is even happening in Washington. Yakima has some of the highest rates of teen pregnancy and infant mortality, specifically the Yakima Valley, where a lot of Indigenous people reside. For Black women, there is this likelihood of experiencing other conditions, health conditions, due to an untreated fertility issue and vice versa. So they both interact with each other. For example, Black women are 41% more likely to develop cervical cancer than white women are, and they are 75% more likely to die from it. That is partially because they are not diagnosed as early as other groups of women. Also, cervical cancer develops due to HPV, and Black women have a lower likelihood of being vaccinated against this or having access to proper reproductive education and preventative measures to stop from contracting HPV. Also, I want to add that PCOS, polycystic ovary syndrome, is something that many women experience, but in Black women specifically, there is a higher chance of their symptoms being heightened because they are more likely to experience insulin resistance, so that makes their symptoms a lot worse. Next, Asian women, they have a lower up-to-date cancer screening. So that goes for breast cancer, cervical cancer, and there's a lot higher of a rate for never screeners, meaning there are many Asian women who never get checked for these types of cancers at all. And there are a lot of factors towards this, but some of it is the barriers that come from the pressure of the idea of being a model minority. So this model minority stereotype puts a lot of pressures of success on Asian women, Asian people in specific, just in general, and so there is less of an incentive to feel like, oh, I need to go to the doctor, and we need to make sure, the doctors need to make sure that these issues are being addressed in this community because they have this covered. They're the model minority. For Latina and Hispanic women, this refers to non-white Latina and Hispanic women. They are more likely to be living in places where there are restrictions on reproductive care, which makes it very difficult to address certain issues that they may experience. 6 million plus Latinas are living in states that have banned or are likely to ban, or they have banned or likely to restrict reproductive care. So I got this quote from one of the participants of my survey, and it says, "I think acknowledging specific implicit biases and calling them out is important. For example, people think Black women have a higher pain tolerance." And this is in response to, do you think methods of educating medical content can be improved to better address implicit bias? So as my second sort of case study, I want to talk about the misconceptions of pain tolerance. There are many false beliefs about the differences, the biological differences between Black people and white people and how they experience pain. For example, there was this study conducted by University of Virginia where medical students and regular people were asked, do you agree with the following statements? Black people have thicker skin than white people. Black people have different nerve endings than white people. 50% of medical students endorse these false biological beliefs. In the same study, Black pain was more likely to be underestimated by 47% than non-Black pain at 33.5%. Black patients specifically, are also less likely to be given pain medications because partially due to the opioid crisis, there is a tendency to view this as drug-seeking behavior. And Cedars-Sinai actually did a study of their patients, like a retrospective study, and they saw that Black and Hispanic patients reported a higher percentage of postpartum pain, but they received lower doses of opioid medication. And this is partially because of this idea that people of color are more likely to be drug-seeking or that they don't experience pain in the same way. So this overall contributes to this idea that people are lying. It goes into this idea of medical gaslighting, where if somebody is reporting pain, they are less likely to be believed about whether or not that's actually true and are less likely to be treated accurately. A Florida IV therapist that was a participant in my study said, I have had an African American woman complaining of feeling off, and she was informed she's anxious. All along, it was severe hyperglycemia. So this is an example of where medical gaslighting comes into play because either due to the biases or surrounding misconceptions of pain tolerance are present, or because of other factors like tendency to be drug-seeking, etc. Next, I'm going to cover the gender bias aspect of this. As an overview, historically, women have not been paid attention to when it comes to reporting pain, reporting issues that they experience at the doctors. There has been misattribution to hormones. Think people saying, oh, she's hysteric, rather than actually diagnosing whatever is wrong. And this is where medical gaslighting comes into play. This bias does not just affect cis women. A Georgia women's health specialist said, I serve a lot of trans and queer clients who are judged by medical providers. And that's because there is an obstacle for finding affirming care that LGBTQ patients can be safe and heard. Additionally, medicine is a male-dominated field. Data analysis from Association of American Medical College says that women accounted for 38% of active physicians in 2022, which is an increase. So good that there are more women present in the medical field. However, men accounted for 62% of active physicians in 2022. And obviously, we live under a system of patriarchy, so medicine is going to be viewed in that lens as well. So for my third case study, This is on the research gaps in women's health. Women's health continues to be understudied. Many providers are unable to diagnose properly or see symptoms effectively because it's hard to diagnose what you don't know. Also, women often have their diseases being presented differently. So, for example, women are less likely to have classic symptoms of a heart attack, so they are less likely to be accurately diagnosed when a heart attack happens. There's also a lack of funding, interest, and inclusion of women in clinical studies and any sort of research. In fact, Congress only mandated women and minority inclusion in clinical research in 1993. And before that, it was very rare for a woman to be considered and how certain drugs or how certain diseases may affect a woman. So next is addressing this issue. Based off of my survey analysis, as you can see, many of the medical professionals that participated believe that implicit bias does affect a professional's ability to accurately diagnose and or treat a patient. So what exactly does this mean? Where exactly can we get to the root of the issue? Well, it was kind of split on whether or not people believe medical education has caused or shaped any personal unconscious bias. However, 56.3% of participants believe that methods of educating medical content can be improved to better address implicit bias. So, to conclude, I have two quotes here. First, from a neurologist. They said, "There are still a number of misconceptions being taught in medical schools because of how ingrained they are in medical practice. The physician workforce includes a wide variety of people of varying ages since graduating from medical school, which means even if things are being taught well in the classroom phase, students are still learning from people with unintentional bias because they are teaching what they learned when they are in school." And from a pediatrician, continuing to emphasize how underrepresented marginalized patient populations have been affected by discriminatory practices in healthcare will allow future healthcare providers to understand the ways in which bias has been historically negatively impacted patient care and allow them to be more proactive to avoid repeating the same unjust practices. As we can see in the presentation with the study from University of Virginia, misconceptions go undressed, especially in medical school, contribute to the bias. Not only is it harmful to patients and to this general idea of human interaction, this culture of apathy surrounding addressing bias, it costs us. The National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities, which is part of the National Institute of Health, revealed that in 2018, racial and ethnic disparities alone cost the U.S. economy $451 billion, and it could reach the trillions by 2040. So I believe that it is better to fix this than let it fester. And by doing so, you contribute to the health of the next generation. Reproductive health contributes to the next generation and allows the next generation to blossom. So generally, with the issue of gender and racial bias and reproductive health care, I found that implicit bias is a prevalent and rampant issue that needs to go checked, because otherwise we have those who are not getting the comprehensive and compassionate care that they need. Thank you. Questions? Yeah, that. Thank you.
I like the quote you put from the neurologist. Are there any solutions that you think would address, if any, of kind of reducing bias of future physicians in med school? If there's any specific?
I think what was really surprising to me was how diverse the amount of time that medical professionals had training. So I think having more frequent training and actually continuing to address these issues over and over and over is probably the best way, because as you said, it's not always just the medical school education, it's people in the past reiterating what they have learned. So there needs to be more continued training to kind of unlearn that.
For the graph about like the pregnancy death that based on this, do you think that's like an international rate as well? I think that's just
So the one that I share specifically is just for the U.S. And it really depends on what type of countries you're looking at. Obviously, for less developed countries, that's going to be higher, that's going to be more prevalent. But really, what stood out about that graph was because compared to other highly developed countries, we have such a high maternal mortality.
Natalie, do you want to disconnect?
Oh, my bad.
Okay, thank you. So, hello everyone. My name is Ariana Ranquist, and my capstone presentation is on single-use plastics and the effect that it had on the environment. So, my research question, which guided the extent of my capstone project, is how do single-use plastics affect the environment? This question helped me to focus my research and dive into areas like pollution, our local recycling practices, and the very own challenges of recycling. It served as the foundation for understanding the environmental consequences of single-use plastics and plastic waste. So why did I choose this topic? Growing up, I've always been passionate about the earth, preserving our environment, and ultimately reducing pollution. During COVID, I realized the detrimental impact that single-use plastics have and made this the focus of my research. I chose this topic due to its ever-growing concern in society today. Plastic waste is exponentially increasing and having significant effects on our environment, including contributing to carbon emissions. We see plastics everywhere, in my social life, school, and even my own home. Understanding how plastic consumption affects future generations has motivated me to raise awareness about this issue. Through my research, I have become more passionate in finding ways to reduce plastic waste and promoting sustainable practices within our community. As stewards for our common home, it is our responsibility to educate and act upon this growing issue. So, plastic pollution. Did you know that half of all plastic produced each year are single-use plastics? Plastics have a long decomposition time, with plastic bags taking up to 1,000 years. With plastic bags taking up to 1,000 years in duration to decompose. One alarming result of plastic waste is the accumulation in our oceans. A striking example is the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, a massive collection of plastic debris in the Pacific Ocean. This patch is a visible reminder of how widespread the issue has become, impacting our marine life, ecosystems, and even our food chain. In the graphic to the right from the Ocean Conservancy, it shows the top 3 items collected from our coastal cleanups, with the top 3 being cigarette butts, food wrappers, food wrappers, and plastic bottle caps. These small everyday items may seem harmless but contribute significantly to our plastic waste problem, emphasizing how critical it is to work towards reducing reliance on plastics and
So the impact on wildlife. There is an estimated 75 to 199 million tons of plastic waste. And to make matters even worse, around 33 billion pounds of plastic enters marine environments every year, adding to this staggering amount.
No, sorry. Here you go.
Thank you. Hello? Is it on? Okay, this has devastating consequences for wildlife. Over 1 million sea animals die annually due to plastic pollution, including but not excluded to turtles, seabirds, and marine mammals who mistake plastic for food or even become entangled in it. But it is not just marine life that is impacted, but our food chain as well. Microplastics are now found in the seafood that we consume as humans, posing risks to human health and threatening our very own food supply. The scale of this problem emphasizes the urgent need in society to reduce our plastic waste and protect both marine ecosystems and human organisms. So, I held an interview with Carly and Ellie, who works for the Pierce County Recycling Center, and she is a solid waste recycling analyst, and she provided some valuable insights into our very own county's recycling efforts and the challenges that we might face. Kari explained that single-use plastics are a major contributor to landfill waste, while items like bottles, jugs, and tubs are recyclable and processed regularly. Lighter plastics, such as bags and wrappers, often bypass recycling systems and end up in landfills. This becomes a significant issue because these items do not get recovered and continue to contribute to pollution. On a positive note, Kari also shared that the technological advancements such as robotic systems at material recovery facilities are improving efficiency. These robots help remove contaminants that are more effective and reduce downtime.
These enable a greater number of plastics to be properly processed. Kari also emphasized the importance of policy solutions, particularly regarding the extended producer responsibility, EPR. EPR holds producers accountable for the entire life cycle of their products, promoting the creation of recyclable, reusable, and environmentally friendly materials. This encourages a shift towards a circular economy, where waste is minimized and resources are reused. These findings from Kari underscore the need for both innovation and policy to tackle these growing plastic waste issues in our county. So the challenge of recycling. Recycling plastics is a critical part of reducing waste in our mission, but the process faces significant challenges. Globally, only about 9% of plastics are actually recycled, which highlights the scale of this issue. Several barriers contribute to this low rate of recycling plastics. One of the most common is contamination. For example, plastic bags often clog recycling machines, which leads to operational shutdowns and delays. Another challenge is sorting of these plastics. Plastic materials must be properly sorted, but many recycling centers struggle with the complexity of doing so accurately or don't have enough manpower to do so efficiently. Although recycling plastics does help reduce emissions compared to producing new plastics, it is still an energy-intensive process. The emission savings depend on the type of plastic being recycled and the technology used. Ultimately, improving the efficiency of recycling systems requires better sorting to prevent contamination. By ensuring cleaner, more organized streams of recyclable materials, we can reduce operational disruptions and make the recycling process more effective. So next I'll be analyzing some data. So I have 3 charts that I kind of want to dive into, along with a student survey and a study I conducted. So this first graphic I think is really interesting in how it covers how plastics enter our world's oceans. So it's from Our World in Data, and it illustrates the key pathways by which plastic enters the ocean and shows the largest contributing factors to ocean's plastics, which comes from mismanaged waste in countries with insufficient waste management systems. So as you see, plastics start in factories to our very own cities, our households, and then eventually into marine ecosystems. Plastic waste typically originates from land, and the graphic tracks how it leads into oceans, A significant issue is that waste, particularly in low and middle income regions, isn't properly managed, leading to plastic entering our ocean. Understanding this process is crucial to know where we can add in interventions that can make the most impact in reducing this pollution. So this graphic on the right also reveals the staggering statistics about plastic drink bottles. 1 million bottles are bought every minute and less than 50% collected for recycling. Only 7% are turned into new bottles, and these numbers emphasize the inefficiency of current recycling systems and the need for improvement. And also, I think it is really interesting on the left chart how it takes 600 years for fishing lines to decompose, which highlights how, if it's in our oceans, how many marine lives are being taken. So I conducted a study where I studied the waste habits of 270 students across 3 lunches. So the majority, 72%, simply threw their waste into the trash with no sorting for recyclables or compostables, while only 24% recycled and less than 5% composted. The results suggest a lack of proper sorting and awareness around waste disposal in our community, highlighting the specific areas where education and intervention can make a significant impact. I also got a Google form sent out to around 80 students that responded, and the survey results from our very own students revealing some concerns. Nearly 50% of students frequently use single-use plastics every day, and almost 44% are unsure about what can actually be recycled. Additionally, 46% believe that plastics are ending up in the oceans and not landfills or recycling centers, highlighting the need for better education again and waste management practices on campus. So the consequences. Plastics may take up to hundreds of years to decompose, polluting our environment. This may contribute to the millions of animals that die each year due to plastic ingestion or entanglement. Not only does this affect our wildlife, the carbon emissions produced as a result of single-use plastics contribute to the acceleration of climate change. Additionally, microplastics are now being found in our food, water, air, and nonetheless leading to health risks in humans as well. By our ignorance to manage plastic waste, we feed into the government's viewpoint of cleaning up pollution as a financial burden. Action steps. Plastic bag bans implemented worldwide and in cosmopolitan states like California and New York are being placed, and I bet you even notice like small bag fees when you go to the grocery store. Big corporations like Starbucks are reducing their contribution to reducing plastic usage through their straws and cup manufacturing processes. And you can also see in this little graphic small steps they're doing to help the future. Personable and tangible action steps for yourself may be including switching to reusable bags, water bottles, and metal straws, as long as implementing different modes of transportation and carpooling, as well as reducing our contribution to fast fashion. To conclude, some advocacy steps we can take at 3 different levels at Bellarmine, in the county, and then statewide. So first, to focus on Bellarmine, encouraging participation in Sustainability Club, better recycling education, and the elimination of single-use plastics on campus could be a good start to push for initially. And then at the county level, we can continue to push for policies that support sustainable practices and easier recycling access. On a statewide level, we can advocate for stronger laws against plastic production, support for green businesses, and improve waste management systems to help reduce plastic pollution. Thank you for listening. Any questions? Susie? So my Stanley's right there on the table. That's my favorite. I like that it fits into my car drink carrier. My Hydro Flask doesn't, so that's my favorite. Yes.
You mentioned fast fashion, like speaking of the water bottles, what's your opinion on like the trends that everything happening with some Stanleys and they're not like a little contributing to?
Yeah, for sure. And I'm not gonna lie, I also am not innocent. I do add to that problem as well. But I do definitely think that people having like numerous of an item is definitely adding to fast fashion, but is definitely something to keep in mind as we continue to shop for.
All right, thank you everybody for coming to this first segment of presentations. Can we give one last applause to our seniors?